Ladies and gentlemen, I'm Shubho and today I'm on to something very exciting. I'm playing your host today for the new episode of Advertising Age, India's talk show, AdAge Unicorns. The idea of AdAge Unicorns is to bring out the inspiring life stories of some of the legends from the field of Indian media, advertising and marketing. My guest today is a man who's a dear friend and has been a client of mine. Dynamic professional and a marketing stroke management veteran. And I think most of you know who he is, presenting to you Lloyd Matthias. Lloyd, on the way to your office, I was kind of wondering what to start off with. And here it is. You're probably one of, in my 15, 20 years of advertising, marketing experience, you're probably one of the top 2 or 3 most popular marketing guys. And I'm talking from the advertising point of view. So what makes you so popular?
Wow. That's a tough one. But to start with, thanks, Shubho. I mean, I'm not sure I deserve a lot of the accolades that you mentioned in the opening, but always a pleasure to catch up with you. About the popularity bit, now that surprises me a bit. I think one is, the only thing I could say was I've moved around a few industries. So I kind of spent my formative years in consumer marketing, right? So PepsiCo was a long stint. And then moved into the technology space with telecommunications, Motorola, and more recently to HP. So I guess I've just interacted with a wide swathe. But I would say more than being popular, I think I've just been fortunate being able to interact with some, terrific advertising partners. In Pepsi, it was the J. Walter Thompson team. Back at Motorola, it was the Ogilvy team. And now we work with BBDO. So I think it's really just a recognition that, most of the successes that I've had the good fortune to be part of, a big part of it has really come out of some terrific friends and partners in the advertising space.
So you're based in Singapore right now. Okay. And what's the experience like? What's Singapore like? How's it been?
Interesting. It's been a couple of years now. I think interesting. It's a nice place. It's very organized. You miss the hustle and bustle of Delhi and Gurgaon and the NCR. But on the positive side, I think it makes for a easier workspace. I think that's positive. I think second part is really lots of learnings. I've kind of worked through a lot of Asia Pacific markets. So a lot of the cultures, a lot of the the markets are new to me, and I think that makes the role that much more challenging. I think the third part is really just trying to kind of assimilate things. One is we at the region you stand in a sense in between what the worldwide wants from you as a marketer and what countries want from you in terms of business. I think really playing that balancing part is really where the real challenge lies.
So many of us, we're kind of aware of your career achievements in the past, like you were saying, from the Cola Major to Motorola to HP, etc. But tell us, what's your trajectory has been like at HP from HP India to HP JPAC, Japan APAC to in a span of 2 years, 2.5 years, something like that. So what's that journey been like?
Interesting to say the least. So I think to start with, I think one is, in a sense, HP is a classic legacy company, right? I think the things that HP is proud of is really its technology, its patents, the fact that it's been kind of, it's a dominant market leader around the world in printing. It has a very big role in terms of PCs. With all that in mind, I think marketing somehow was not kind of center to HP's entire thing. So I think one of the challenges really is to, really kind of go back, understand the consumer, and make sure you stay a strong custodian or a voice of the customer within the organization. I think that's been the big challenge. The other part, which is real to the IT industry, is that PCs as a market are flat to declining, right? So one of the challenges really we face is how do we kind of, reignite interest in the category. For a lot of young people, they can pretty much do everything, that older folks can do out of a smartphone. So I think it's really rediscovering the PC and really making it a relevant part of their lives. And I think that to me is the big challenge.
If I may interrupt, Lloyd is the PC marketing head. Okay, that's the official designation, but of course it goes far beyond that. So you were telling us about your primary marketing challenges in this area. Can you expand on that a little
so I think
more?
primarily it's two things. One is the fact that this market is flat to declining. Secondly, it's a legacy company that's largely technology oriented. So kind of bringing marketing center stage is always a challenge, and the fact that consumers are really looking at that aspect of it.
Right.
I think the third thing is really the young demographic. So across Asia Pacific markets where I operate, the primary buyers today are young people, and a lot of our business comes from the B2B side, but even a lot of the IT decision makers, the people who take calls in offices today are young. It's the startup ecosystem, it's people starting SMBs. And I think it's really reorienting the whole conversation to talk to the mature millennials and the millennials as we call them in the organization. And finding interesting threads of conversation to build up to them. I think that's the big challenge, right? We began the journey last year with this whole theme of bend the rules, right? Looking at a technology company kind of talking through a lifestyle statement and yet finding a role for the product. So I think it's this reorientation and bringing more of a consumer centricity that is the biggest challenge.
In fact, it's interesting that you're talking about the youth, the younger, the internet generation of millennials, whatever you call them. So last time we met about a year and a half, 2 years back, we were kind of, there were all these surveys which were saying, 50%, 60% of India is on mobile, etc. So, in the current ecosystem, whether you call it the startup ecosystem or whatever, okay, what is the role of PCs? How is it doing? PC, mobile, this fragmentation. Can you say a little bit about that?
Yeah, I think if we talk of one defining kind of trend that India has seen in the last couple of decades, it's really the spread or the ubiquity of mobile phones, right? So, talking of about 75 to 80% penetration. So the fact is that India pretty much has reached saturation in the mobility space. In that process, what happened was a lot of Indians really jump shifted straight and kind of skipped the PC phase. A lot of people really went technologically, starting from mobile and actually did a lot of their e-commerce, a lot of their transactions on the mobile. And therefore, unlike elsewhere in the world where there was this whole transition, gradual process where people actually adopted the PC and then over time moved to a smartphone, I think India jump shifted that process. And I think that, in a sense, is a bit of a challenge, is how do you still bring the relevance of the personal computer back into people's lives, right? So it starts from the fact that kids in high school and college, they need a lot of it to work for their projects. It starts with the fact that the browsing experience, the fact that a lot of the e-commerce and the work you do is so much more easier off a PC. And really it's bringing that relevance back, but not again just talking tech specs, right? So I think a fact that a lot of consumers have forgotten is that the PC has evolved, right? What 5 years back was this big heavy brick that you really lugged around in a laptop bag, today is almost as light and sleek as a kind of a large size tablet, right? So the PC has evolved, it's become more powerful, its ability to perform more functions. A lot of people are consuming entertainment of their PCs. So I think it's communicating this whole transition to the young consumer. I think that's the challenge that we currently face, and that's really what we're addressing.
Sure, it's interesting that you mentioned PC evolved. In fact, I was just telling you before the interview that I'm with a healthcare company, and PCs are primary medium. We don't really target mobile because our audience is women in a certain demographic, certain psychographic, and PC is giving us far more clicks and brand love, whatever you call it. We still haven't. I'm going to lay off mobile for a little while. So it's interesting that you mentioned.
Yeah, I mean, now that you said that, it's also a challenge. We recognize that a lot of the big e-commerce players, they're pretty heavily app dependent, and their belief is that if someone downloads their app on the smartphone, they become loyal to them over time. And we've demonstrated to some of them the fact that with people shopping on PCs, the experience is much more richer. You can almost recreate a kind of real world retail ambience. So you're on the market for a bright colored shirt, the way you can see it off a PC with a larger screen, the way you can navigate your way around. I think that experience tends to be richer. And therefore, we're working with a lot of them to kind of work off apps that sit off the web, so people can actually have a much more richer experience. And also the whole convergence, the fact that a lot of people use their PC and plug it onto their home television, so you have larger screen formats. It's no longer that 13-inch, 14-inch restriction. And therefore you can you can pretty much do anything at your time, at your pace.
And I'm sure you know about the, big announcements of, we're going app only, and then suddenly after 3 months, everyone's back to PC. I'm sure you're aware of all that. Lloyd, you were an entrepreneur, a full-on entrepreneur for a brief while, before joining, HP, I think. And if I remember right, you were kind of laying out a roadmap for, companies to come to India, something like that. You want to share a little bit about that experience?
Sure. So I think kind of completed 20 years in the corporate world, and you always kind of sense that maybe you're missing out on something. So I got together with a couple of former colleagues.
Okay.
And we set up a company called Green Bean Ventures.
Ah,
Now, the whole objective of Green Bean Ventures was twofold. I think one was we're seeing in the late 2008, 2009, a lot of excitement around the startup ecosystem. The fact that there were lots of companies in. I think one thing that we recognize that while these are a lot of technocrats with great ideas, I think their whole go-to-market strategy, kind of reaching out to customers, drawing up a 3 to 5 year roadmap, I think that part was missing. We saw that as a great opportunity. We spoke to a few folks in the private equity space, and they really believed that there was, a kind of need gap for having professionals with considerable experience really guide some of these startups to the early stages. And really that was what the objective was. So we helped companies that kind of was starting up with some great technology idea. We helped them go to market through their first couple of years. And we tried out some interesting revenue models. So revenue share, a bit of equity swap, a little bit of normal kind of consulting fee. So that was an interesting 3 years.
And it's really big right now, right? And,
well, it is. It's I mean, it's a kind of two-way thing. I mean, I found it kind of exciting to start with lots of new learnings, understanding new technologies, new spaces. But at the same time, I guess that is one of the reasons I chose to come back. I think you miss some of the kind of the scale and the rigor and just the teams you work with. I mean, the whole kind of cross-cultural teams that you work with in large corporations. And I spent the bulk of my life, working for the big MNCs. So I think it's an individual choice. So while my partners continue to run the company, I chose to come right back to the corporate world.
But for me and many colleagues in advertising who worked with you, again to go back to the first question, we see you more of an entrepreneurial kind of guy than a suit, if you'll excuse the term, right? In a three-piece suit with a tie. So you've always been, how should I put it? There's a lot of energy that you bring to the table. That's what a colleague, who you know very well, based in Singapore, was talking about this morning. The amount of energy that Lloyd brings to the table, to a room, is very, very high. So Lloyd, I'm sorry, were you about to say something?
Yeah, I just said I think the advantage. The way I look at it is that yes, I think marketing, the one thing that keeps you excited about marketing is that every day is a new challenge, trying to interpret and understand the consumer and then make your product more relevant to his life. And I think, that really excites me. I mean, that is something that I found exciting. And one would think that as an entrepreneur, building the entire journey would be really the next step. But you realize that there are a lot of other admin-related challenges that may not necessarily be suitable, right? So classically in a large organization, I think you're able to focus on the kind of the core essence of marketing, understanding the consumer and making sure your product meets his needs, and then getting into this whole evolving conversation.
If I may ask a question, I mean, this is a startup world kind of, which is probably the flavor of the year or flavor of the whatever. In startups, the typical .coms, etc., marketing is seen as a very ROI-driven kind of activity, as in, if I may use the term, very short-term, very lead generation kind of thing. As a classic marketer who's tasted, who's moved big, brands from point A to point B, what's your point of view on this? What's your opinion?
I think there's no shortcut. I think eventually, consumers over time recognize the narrative of a brand and what it means to their lives, right? So while a lot of marketing in various organizations gets pushed into a kind of demand generation or a lead generation machine, I think that is a critical part. At the end of the day, marketing exists in the context of a business. But I think you have to recognize that marketing is also over time trying to endear that company's products to the consumer. And the only way it can happen is that if you have a larger narrative and look at it as a slightly longer time frame, right? So it can't just be a transaction saying that the number of clicks I can drive or the number of, kind of shopping baskets that get created. I think you need to look at it over a period of time because transactions always tend to, have ups and downs, whereas classic brands and endurance kind of lasts much longer. And I clearly believe that whatever you do has to have that long tail to it. It's not just about, a price off or a quick spot promotion that will give you a little leap. I think the idea is. And therefore the challenge, as a marketer, and if I look back at some of the my favorite campaigns and stuff that I've been associated with, are campaigns that effectively, drive units of business in the short run, but also give a lot to the brand in the long run. Back in the many years I spent in the cola business, I remember the big joy was when the government sometime in the mid-90s permitted under the crown promotions you could actually have, right? And the classic model that most companies followed was sweepstakes, which is you buy yourself a Pepsi, pop the crown open, and you might get a big prize. And I think the whole couching of it, we worked together with J. Walter Thompson, and the whole expression that they created around that campaign was "Mera number kab aayega." right? Which is a classic expression of an Indian growing up in the mid-90s. We always had to wait for an opportunity, whether it was qualifying for the IIT or standing in long queues to get provisions and such like. And I think the whole articulation of Mera number kab aayega was such a larger brand statement than purely saying that pop a crown open and win a prize. I think therefore it's that larger expression that sometimes makes a brand endear itself and become part of people's lives.
Totally, totally. The narrative, the story, I mean, and it's not just brands. I see a lot of politicians using the same marketing tools to, create these narratives, own these narratives. And, it's working not just at a local level, but at a national level.
Absolutely.
Okay, Lloyd, so you started off, if you may go back to the past, you started off with a BSc in geology. You were studying for a bachelor's in geology and dropped out and did an MBA. Right?
Well, a logical continuation actually. So I, back in Bombay in St. Xavier's, I chose to do geology. I was quite fascinated with the subject, and I thought that's what I would make a profession. But I think soon, as I was graduating my third year, I just realized that, kind of working in a rig somewhere would not really be my idea of, of an interesting kind of career. And then I, took the MBA entrance and kind of gone to MBA, and then began, spent the first few years of my career in sales. I started off with Onida, which back in the late 80s and early 90s was a pretty powerful brand, and slowly got into the business of selling. I think somewhere in the course switched to the whole beverage space, and
the cola brand.
Absolutely.
Okay. Actually, I saw you a little bit of. What's that role that Harrison Ford played? Indiana Jones as a geologist, with the cap and Okay. So, do you want to share any experiences from your early days at Onida sales?
Well, interesting. So, Onida, I think the big challenge then was the fact that it was largely Indian brands that dominated the market, right? In the early 80s, early 90s, it was really Onida, Videocon, BPL, and the LGs and Samsungs were kind of relatively smaller players. So, I think the challenge really was about how do you Onida chose a very differential positioning. It was it positioned itself premium. I think as a salesperson, the challenge was how do you still keep that premiumness in all your sales execution. So while we were doing things like institutional sales, going to smaller markets, I think we're still keeping the aspirational angle. I think that's something which Onida did pretty well. I think that was one of the challenges. And that was the early days, and then subsequently, of course, moved to Pepsi. Again, very different challenge because it was a market that was owned by pretty much one company, right? So the Chauhans, we ran Thumbs Up at that point in time. They pretty much dominated the market, and then kind of really getting kind of Pepsi a toehold in the market. I was running marketing for the western part of the country. Was a whole new experience. It was a big challenge, and a lot of the methodologies that some of the competitors used weren't even ethical, but you still had to keep in the confines of what large companies define as ethical, and yet fight the cola war as brutally as possible.
Yeah, there's this word which is very popular with these young startup companies, and sorry if I keep going back to startups because that's where I live right now, and the word is hack. Okay. So you started off in sales, okay, and then of course the cola company, etc. Can you tell us some instances of hacks where you kind of leapfrog from 2 or 3 to 5? I mean, not in a shortcut sense, but in a very, I don't know, breakthrough sort of way. Can you share any instances?
Well, I would typically think of the context of back in the early days of the beverages, which was really a very kind of, it's very numbers driven, a rigorous driven game, right? You run 40 trucks in the morning, they go out, they service outlets, and if your competitor's truck gets there before you, they've locked up the refrigerator with his products and you don't exist. So I think it's really about the idea of trying to do it differently and getting that same thought permeate down to your sales team. So standing up in a sales warehouse and talking to the beverage salesmen, the guys who ride the trucks, and telling them why it's important for them to beat their competitor ahead of the store. Because for an average guy looking for a chilled product, it's not the brand that matters, right? On a hot summer's day, you want to reach out for the nearest chilled beverage that you have, and therefore the whole truth that for all the marketing you do, the point of purchase, the penny drop moment is really at the storefront. And if your salesman isn't there and your product isn't available in the chilled ambience, no amount of marketing can save it. I think that for me was a kind of critical learning there.
Yeah. So you worked across many different categories, consumer goods, telecom, technology, etc. So these are different countries in a sense. How was your journey so seamless? I mean, from what I know.
I think in each case, if you remember that, it's the consumer that holds center stage. So I was fortunate to be part of the cola wars in the 90s when, in a sense, it was exciting, right? For a young person growing up in the 90s, the Pepsis and the Cokes took a big part of mind space. And pretty much over 2000s, telecom became center stage, right? Around the time I moved to Motorola. And that again was an interesting case because, clearly Nokia was the dominant player. Motorola was relatively marginal and considered kind of better known for its two-way walkie-talkie radios than mobile phones.
Yeah.
I think it was really changing the narrative, just bringing the whole option to the fact and talking to younger people, saying that, hey, now we've got a phone that's radically different from what everyone else uses, almost repositioning the market leader as something for older people. And then kind of changing the whole narrative from really being tech specific into lifestyle and attitude. So in that sense, like I believe for a good marketer, it's really about being able to curate the conversation to your advantage. Right? And mediums are just a way to do it, right? Today people talk of digital conversations. To my mind, that's just another medium. But if you're able to curate the conversations around, like we did in Motorola, which is really turn the whole emphasis around style, around design, I think that's what consumers tend to respond to, right? So no amount of, amount of memory or RAM is going to convince a consumer as much as a simple style statement.
I remember when I was at Ogilvy and you were at Motorola, you kind of spearheaded the launch of the Moto Razr.
Yep.
And when you say style statement amongst youth, I can completely, my mind goes back to those days. I think it was 10 years back or maybe...
Yeah, even more, maybe almost 11 or 12 years. I think interesting. I mean, now that you said it, it reminds me that, we had to convey this whole essence of style more than just with a television commercial. I think one of the nice ideas that came wrapping, I think, with the Ogilvy team was when you unveil the product at the retail level, how do you convey that same sense of style? So we actually didn't have the normal, guy who's kind of getting off a tempo and loading product.
Right.
We actually had these two very smartly dressed, kind of emerging straight from a Hollywood blockbuster kind of thing, and they presented the first product. It was almost like a little ramp walk in the store. And the normal retailer said, my God, what is this, right? It kind of created a furor in the market. So it was really taking the whole idea of the Moto Razr standing for style, but translating it in a manner that, the average store in a Nehru place would also say, oh my God, that's different, right? It would make him reevaluate his perception and his dependence on the market leader at that point in time.
Yeah.